July 19th, 1989. United Airlines Flight 232 is attempting to make an emergency landing at Sioux City Airport in Iowa. The pilots have no control of the plane, and it's traveling at over 400 kilometers an hour, way too fast for a safe touchdown. Disaster is merely seconds away, with the airplane's crew fighting for the lives of themselves and every single passenger on board. The plane, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, had taken off from Denver's Stapleton Airport en route to Philadelphia International Airport, with 296 passengers and crew aboard. Many of the passengers were traveling with young children, due to a promotion whereby children under 14 with an accompanying adult could fly for just a penny. Barely an hour into the flight, the plane is rocked by a large bang. Almost immediately, the autopilot disengages, and indicators show Captain Al Haynes that the number 2 engine has malfunctioned. He tries to reduce power to that engine, but the throttles are jammed. The crew are somehow able to shut the engine down completely, but as they do this, they discover they could no longer control the plane with their control columns. Flight engineer Dudley Dvorak notices that all the hydraulic systems, essential for controlling the plane, are, alarmingly, fully depleted. The hydraulic systems operate the plane's flaps, ailerons, rudder, and elevator. Without these controls, the pilots won't be able to steer the plane, or take it up or down. All attempts to use auxiliary power to bring these systems back online prove unsuccessful. The plane enters a pattern of flight where it moves up and down in a wave-like pattern. At the same time, it begins banking further and further to the right. The crew can find no procedures for dealing with this situation. Even a desperate radio call to United Airlines maintenance yields no results. Luckily for the crew, 46-year-old Denny Fitch, a DC-10 flight instructor, is a passenger on the flight. He recognizes the rolling pitch effect the plane is experiencing. He had studied the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which occurred just 4 years prior. That flight had also lost all hydraulics and had also endured similar up and down movement before crashing. After speaking to a flight attendant, he is taken up to the cockpit. Once there, he works with the flight crew to quickly determine what the plane can and cannot do. They find that they are able to exercise some rudimentary control, and somewhat steer the plane to the right by adjusting the power to the remaining engines. Captain Haynes asks Fitch to take control of the throttles so he can focus on the control column. The crew is able to turn the stricken plane towards Sioux Gateway Airport. Unable to line the plane up properly with runway 31 as planned, the crew aims instead for runway 22. Unfortunately, this runway is filled with rescue vehicles that have assembled for their emergency landing. These vehicles, however, are quickly moved out of the way. The plane is so out of control that it approaches at a speed of 400 kilometers an hour, around 150 kilometers an hour faster than normal. On approach, Flight 232 begins to bank sharply to the right. The crew increases thrust to the right engine to counteract this roll, but it was too late. The right wing strikes the runway, breaking off as the rest of the aircraft slams into the ground. The fuselage breaks apart from the impact and the fuel ignites. The aircraft disintegrates in a massive fireball, with the mostly intact cockpit and tail sections coming to rest in the cornfields near the airport. Even with fire engines already on scene, the fire is so intense that it burned for more than 5 hours. The crash and fire were so violent that first responders are doubtful anyone could have survived. And yet, many did. 185 people lived through the crash, with one survivor later dying from their injuries. Indeed, not only did many people survive, but in many cases, they helped one another escape the burning wreckage of the plane. Passenger Jerry Schemmel, for example, loses a friend in the crash, but escapes the wreckage, only to go back in to save an 11-month-old child. Despite the actions of the surviving passengers and the prompt response of emergency services, 112 people lose their lives in the disaster. The investigation into the crash of Flight 232 was swift, but not straightforward. The main focus of the investigation, the number 2 engine, was missing parts of its disc fan. These could not be found at the crash site or in the immediate area. Its manufacturer, General Electric, put up a reward for the missing components, which was claimed when a farmer found them in a field 3 months later. Test results were conclusive. The engine disc fan had developed a fault when it was manufactured back in 1971. The steel used had an impurity, which caused it to fatigue and crack over time, finally giving way mid-flight. United Airlines maintenance personnel should have caught this fatigue crack early on, but it was found that procedures at the airline paid little attention to faults such as this one. The NTSB found that when the disc failed, it did so with explosive force, damaging not only the engine assembly itself, but also part of the tail, rear elevators, and the hydraulics, causing them to leak out until they were empty. This explained why the crew had experienced so much difficulty controlling the plane. After the investigation was concluded and the findings published, many changes were made in the aviation industry. Newly built aircraft were given upgraded systems to prevent a loss of hydraulics. United updated its maintenance procedures, and Flight 232 became a case study demonstrating excellent crew resource management in a crisis. Indeed, the crew worked so well together that, when challenged with a recreation of the disaster in a simulator, test pilots could not match or exceed their performance. The crew was highly commended for carrying out what was referred to as an impossible landing. Captain Haynes received many awards and much of the recognition, although he always insisted that credit was shared equally with his fellow crew members, who had all survived the crash with serious injuries. He would go on to be a public speaker on aviation safety and would appear in many interviews describing his experience that day. A memorial to those who lost their lives was erected years later. The DC-10s in United's fleet would continue to fly for a number of years, until they were eventually retired in 2001. Though the crash of United 232 resulted in the loss of many lives, were it not for the teamwork, ingenuity, and incredibly calm response of the crew, the end result could have been significantly worse.